In my last video with these cards, I said that you don't absolutely need 16GB of VRAM, and we did some tests with some of the more popular games that people play, including myself, and yeah, I was wrong, at least sort of. A few people had an issue with my testing methodology, which is fair enough, although I think my biggest failing, as usual, was in my explanation. So in this video, I want to do a bit more testing with the same games but at ultra settings and do a lot more explaining, so let's get into it. For the most part here, I'm testing exclusively at 4K to see how bad it gets, although for the few games that do break the 8GB limit, I've tested at 1440p as well to see how that goes too. Amazingly, Cyberpunk on ultra settings at 4K only uses 7.7 gig of VRAM at most, or 7.3 gig on average. While I'm sure enabling ray tracing would peak us over, we're already at 44 FPS average here. That's like Steam Deck levels of performance, so it would be a slideshow, especially on these AMD cards. This is kind of illustrative of the point I was trying to make in the last video, which is that while some games will definitely eat up more than 8GB of VRAM, you're likely to have pretty naff performance on either of the cards, kind of regardless. Anyway, Helldivers 2 is in the same boat with a sub 60 FPS average at 54 FPS and only 6.6GB of VRAM usage at most. It's worth noting that a lot of these games have some form of upscaling tech enabled either by default or as part of their presets. I've purposely left them as is, which might change the VRAM usage a little, but certainly not significantly, and it's very much the expected behaviour, hence keeping them that way. Still, a sub 60 FPS result, even with some upscaling, isn't the best experience. Starfield is one that I tested at both 4K and 1440p, and also has upscaling enabled as part of the settings presets. At 4K we're getting just 48 FPS average and 7.55GB of VRAM usage at ultra settings. That still isn't a limiting factor for the 8GB card, although the outright performance itself is. At 1440p, the actual performance is better at 70.7 FPS average, although it still isn't great, but VRAM usage falls equally, needing just 6.8GB at most to run Starfield of all games at 1440p on ultra settings. As for the games that do exceed the 8GB cap, surprisingly the first up is Rainbow Six Siege. That even has an in-game stat that tells you how much VRAM it expects to use, and as far as I can tell, it's wildly off. It said something like 5.5GB of VRAM at 4K on Ultra Plus settings, but at least according to hardware info, it actually used 8.3GB. It's only just over the limit at 4K on the absolute highest settings, but the catch here is that you're only getting 106 FPS average, which sure for 4K sounds decent, but for a game like Siege, that's pretty terrible. You'd be a pretty significant competitive disadvantage, like just in latency alone, you've gone from a couple of milliseconds to tens of milliseconds, and that's not counting the smoothness difference either. Playing Siege on Ultra Plus settings, regardless of the resolution, is literally shooting yourself in the foot, so why would you? Shadow the Tomb Raider is next. That one was pretty close to the limit on the high settings, and sure, this is a game that you're more likely to care about visuals than you do about the outright number of frames per second, so let's see what highest has to offer. At 4K, you're looking at 68 FPS average and 9.7GB of VRAM usage at most. Finally, we've found a game that can actually max out the 8GB card. Huzzah! At 68 FPS though, I don't think that I would be playing on max settings here regardless of the card, and I probably wouldn't be playing at 4K either. Interestingly though, at 1440p on the highest settings, we get much better performance at 134 FPS average, but still just above the 8GB limit at 8.9 gigs peak or 8.44 on average. So yeah, Shadow the Tomb Raider is a game that, on max settings, you will prefer the 16 gig card, even at 1440p. Sweet. Finally, and amazingly worst VRAM usage of all, CS2. On very high settings, which is an even worse idea than playing on Ultra Plus in Siege, at 4K we get just 57.6 FPS. Yeah, under 60 FPS and 10 gigabytes of VRAM usage. To call playing on very high settings an idiotic move would be a bit of an understatement. Getting less than 60 FPS just to have the players that kill you look a touch of sharper and better shaded is pretty hilarious, so I guess feel free to do you there. At 1440p, we're only a breath above 8GB at 8.26 max or 8.02 gig on average, with a better but still pretty terrible for CS2 125 FPS average. Again, for competitive games like CS or Siege, even if you play casually, you will much prefer playing on more competitive settings. One suggestion that was brought up from the last video was game choice. Namely, more recent story-based games, and even looking at Steve from Hardware Unboxed data from a 4060 Ti in games like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Last of Us Part 1, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, Homeworld 3 and Hogwarts Legacy, you can certainly find settings that peak you over 8GB of VRAM usage, including at 1440p, and sometimes even at 1080p. And for sure, if those are the games that you want to play and you're okay with the sort of performance hit from running at higher settings, then sure, the 16 gig card is the better choice for you. That's where I messed up, not even mentioning that genre of games, and that, yeah, for those games you absolutely will see a noticeable benefit from the 16 gig card. The thing is though, my fight isn't with the 16 gig card here, it's for the 8 gig one. The running theme with the launch of this 8GB 96CXT was that its mere existence was an affront to humanity. And that my point is that, especially at the current hefty discounts, it still very much has a place. If you don't fancy playing this niche of story-based, sloptimized games, you're absolutely going to get the same experience and performance on the 8 gig card as you are on the 16 gig one. You don't need to be bullied into paying almost twice as much for 16 gigabytes of VRAM when for a healthy majority of games, you simply don't need it yet. And I suspect you're going to run out of GPU horsepower before you run out of VRAM for a lot of them. As I said in the first video, the 16 gig card is undoubtedly better. And if the price difference was considerably smaller, it would be much easier to write the 8 gig card off as irrelevant and useless. But with this much money on the line, I can wholeheartedly see why you'd buy the 8 gig card, and I don't think you should feel bad for doing so. Also, I very much think that the fight should be at the games themselves rather than the hardware. Games that are sucking back 10 plus gigabytes of VRAM at freaking 1080p, even without ray tracing, well, that just sounds like per game optimization. I mean, hell, if Cyberpunk can do it. Like, surely we should be championing, like, better game development and not railing on GPU makers for making under-spec GPUs for the poorly optimized games. At least that's my thoughts, and it's definitely an AMD branded take because I think that these cards are priced relatively well for what they offer. On the Nvidia side of things, especially because they control like 90% of the GPU market, it's a slightly different story, and I can understand and actually very much agree with the fact that they have been limiting the VRAM like options for quite a while now. So that's maybe a different thing, but yeah, those are my thoughts. Again, I would still love to hear what you think in the comments down below. So yeah, I hope that explains some things at least a little bit better. I'm always a bit bad at, you know, getting points across. So yeah, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. If you do want to see more videos like this one, haven't scared you off, feel free to hit the subscribe button. Check out, if you haven't seen the first one, the video in the end cards above. And otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you in the next video.